Good morning, everybody. Welcome again to our Sunday service. Our church gathers here every week. This is our time and space to pause from the busyness of the week, from all the burdens that we have at work and family, and just be together with the Lord. And so if this is your first time here, really glad that you could join us today. Again, to all of our members, I hope that today could be a Memorial Day where we not just because it's Memorial Day weekend, but it's because it's a weekend where we can be voting in potentially first group of elders. And if you're new to our church, really hope that you could get to know our church and hope you could join that welcoming lunch. Would love to get to meet anyone who is visiting our church and for you to connect with us. This is your first time here. We are in the middle, or not in the middle, actually, in the beginning of a sermon series of the middle of the book of Exodus. We started the second half last week as continuation since the beginning of 2024. And we're going to be looking at a passage that I'm pretty sure, whether you grew up in the church or not, very familiar, might be even a little bit triggering because your parents just might have put this down your throat, might have just been someone who just pounded this on your head, but yet it is a word for us to read today. So we're going to be looking at Exodus chapter 20, verses 1 to 17. And here at our church, we believe that when we read the scriptures, our God is alive and living. So can we all rise together as we read this passage, Exodus chapter 20, verses 1 to 17. So starting in verse 1, it writes, "Then God spoke all these words, I am the Lord your God, who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the place of slavery. Do not have other gods besides me. Do not make an idol for yourself, whether in the shape of anything in the heavens above, or on the earth below, or in the waters under the earth. Do not bow and worship to them, and do not serve them. For I, the Lord your God, am a jealous God, bringing the consequences of the father's iniquity on the children to the third and fourth generations of those who hate me, but showing faithful love to 1,000 generations of those who love me and keep my commands. Do not misuse the name of the Lord your God, because the Lord will not leave anyone unpunished who misuses his name. Remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. You are to labor 6 days and do all your work, but on the seventh day is a Sabbath to the Lord your God. You must not do any work, you, your sons or daughter, your male or female servant, your livestock, or the resident alien who is within your city gates. For the Lord made the heavens and the earth, the sea, and everything in them in 6 days. Then he rested on the seventh day. Therefore the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and declared it holy. Honor your father and your mother so that you may have a long life in the land that the Lord your God is giving you. Do not murder. Do not commit adultery. Do not steal. Do not give false testimony against your neighbor. Do not covet your neighbor's house. Do not covet your neighbor's wife, his male or female servant, his ox or donkey, or anything that belongs to your neighbor." This is the reading of God's word. Can I pray for us before we begin? Lord, we come before you today. May what you have to say to us awaken our souls, stir our hearts, and be able to strengthen us throughout this week. Would you speak today in your son's name? Amen. You may be seated. Are you guys familiar with the website IMDb? You guys know imdb.com? It is the world's largest film database, and they have like rankings of pretty much people can contribute what they think are like the 5-star movie ratings and so forth. Does anybody know the highest ranked film on imdb.com? And it's been like the highest ranked film for like the past like 20 years or so. Anybody know? Think of a movie in your mind. It's probably not that movie. In our first service, people were like, The Godfather or The Dark Knight or so forth. None of those. You know what the highest ranked movie is on IMDb of all time? The Shawshank Redemption. Yes, check it. It's on there. Again, how many of you guys have seen The Shawshank Redemption? Okay, so most of us have seen it. Okay, so those of you who have not seen it, there is one sermon application today. Watch The Shawshank Redemption. Go home. It is going to be a great watch. For those of you who have seen it, you might remember that the story, it's about a young banker who was given a life sentence in jail because he was accused of murdering his wife. And so he goes to state prison and he meets all these different inmates in the state prison. And one of the inmates he meets, if you remember, is this old person named Brooks. Brooks was in prison for about 50 years. And so he was kind of like that old timer who just knew the ins and outs of how the prison system worked. But halfway through the movie, what you see happens is Brooks, he gets his parole papers and he's released after 50 years in prison. So here's a scene of Brooks leaving the prison. So again, old man going out into the world. And what's interesting is when you actually trace his life, the movie shows like what happens to him. He kind of struggles life outside of prison because the world was really different for him. 50 years ago to now, he just does not know what this new world is, the automobiles, how fast they're moving, telephones, and how that works. And so he is like overwhelmed day in and day out, like just all the stuff that's happening, to the point where at one point, he eventually takes his own life. And when the prisoners were heard about it and they asked, like, why was he not happy when he was released? They said, Brooks, he was institutionalized, meaning that even though he was free from prison, he did not know how to live freely. He did not know how to navigate life outside the prison walls because of the 50 years that he was incarcerated. As we look at the book of Exodus, I would argue that the Israelites, they are like Brooks. They're like this character. They were enslaved, lived as slaves in Egypt for 400 years. Yahweh, we read in the story, he frees them from slavery. All of us knows the Prince of Egypt story, how he has them cross the Red Sea. And yet, the fascinating thing about this is Israel, even though they are now out of Egypt, out of bondage, they keep saying, let's go back to Egypt. Bring us back. We should go back to the land of slavery. And the reason why Israel was like this is because Israel, I would argue, they were also institutionalized. Even though they were free, they did not know how to live freely. And that's why the story of Exodus, it does not end at the crossing of the Red Sea, but we talked about last week how Exodus, it's 20 more chapters after the Red Sea crossing, 20 chapters at Mount Sinai, a whole year camped at this mountain. Why? Because chapters 1 to 18 of Exodus, God removed Israel out from slavery, but we are looking at the journey of God removing the slavery out from Israel. That is what the whole second half of Exodus is about. Now, that first half, how God removed Israel from slavery, if you're familiar with the movies or if you've been tracking with us, it was primarily the 10 plagues that God used against Egypt to deliver them out of slavery. How is God going to take the slavery out of Egypt? Fascinating. It's another 10 number, the 10 commandments. The 10 commandments are going to be the focus, actually, of a lot of what we're going to be talking about. And if you're like me, it's been a long time since you thought about the 10 commandments. It's been a long time. And by no means has it often been presented as a way for God to take out the slavery from Israel. Because if you're like me, a couple of different thoughts come into mind when you think about the 10 commandments. For example, 10 commandments being freedom. No, for us, we actually think the 10 commandments is slavery. We live in a culture where we do our own thing. Don't tell me what to do. I do what I want. And so any type of rules that are given to us, it naturally feels restrictive to us individualized modern Western people. 10 commandments feels like a burden to us. Or at best, if you have a high opinion of 10 commandments, you might see it as something that's a morality system, a way for us to give, it's a good advice for people to just have as a moral compass. And so we tell our kids about the 10 commandments because it's just a system to make them a good person. And that's how we view the 10 commandments. I think what's most relevant to us here today, again, who grew up in the Sunday school stuff where we know the 10 commandments, we have a vague idea of what it is. It's not maybe slavery. It's not even just about morality. It's just irrelevant to us. It's something that if you actually read it, like, does it apply to you? Like, I don't worship other gods. Oh, I go to church on Sundays. Oh, I look at the 10 commandments. Oh, I haven't stolen anything since the second grade. Oh, I don't covet my neighbor's donkey. He doesn't even have a donkey. Like, that isn't something that really applies to us. Aren't we Christians? Isn't the 10 commandments an Old Testament thing, but now we're New Testament followers of Jesus, so that doesn't really apply? And that's just kind of how we view the 10 commandments. It's something that's there in our history, not really something we've reflected upon in a long time. And so this is kind of brushing off the dust of these old literal tablets that are being presented to us. And yet, such a different way of viewing the 10 commandments that we have today versus ancient Israel. The Israelites, when they saw the 10 commandments, it was not slavery, it was not a burden, it wasn't irrelevant. In fact, it was something that they saw as a blessed gift. This wasn't like, oh, we have to follow God so that he'll love us. They were actually, when they received the 10 commandments, the Israelites were like, yes, this is what we've been waiting for. Psalm chapter 1, for example. The first psalm in the Bible, it says, blessed is the man, not who has a lot of money, not blessed is the man whose kids make it off to a great university, blessed is the man who has a high intelligence score. Like that is not what it says. Not even blessed is the man who evangelizes or prays. Psalm 1 says, blessed is the man who meditates upon the law of the Lord. Blessed is that person where the law is close to your heart. Psalm 119 is the longest psalm. If you look there, it's like chapters after chapters of a singular topic that the person keeps describing as being beautiful, and it's about the law. They like delighted in the law. What's even most fascinating is in Jewish history, not just Jews back then, but even today, there are 3 major feasts that Jewish people celebrate, and here are the 3 feasts. The first one is Passover. Passover is still celebrated this day by Israelites, and there are people where this is a time to remember to eat and celebrate the Exodus when God brought the Israelites across the Red Sea. The second feast is the Feast of Tabernacles, where this is a time where we remember how God provided for our ancestors through the wilderness, gave them manna and water, and was present with them. Do you know what the third feast is celebrated? What it's called? Pentecost. And I know for Christians, we think of Pentecost, Holy Spirit and so forth, but Jewish people, that wasn't what they're celebrating. The word Penta, it's literally 50. It's the 50th day after the Exodus. And you know what happened the 50th day after the Exodus? The law. This is the moment where God gave the 10 commandments, and they're like, we need to celebrate this day. It's like an anniversary. It's like a birthday. Let's remember and celebrate this joyful day because not only did Yahweh bring us out of slavery, but this is the day he taught us how to no longer live as slaves. This is precious instruction that Yahweh gives to us. And again, now it sounds strange because I mentioned earlier, we live in a culture where we want to do our own thing. We kind of walk to the beat of our own drum. And yet, I think deep down inside all of us, there is a hunger and a desire for guidance in our lives. I mean, all of us here, you are independent, you're adults, you're free, you live in a country that does not put external pressure for you to do anything. You, again, would think that we'd be feeling so happy just doing what we want, and yet a lot of us, we're so lost. Like, think about, for example, the popular books that are published these days. For the past 20 years, you know what type of titles are like just popular for people who don't even read, but they turn to these books? It's books like Atomic Habits, Highly Effective Habits of an Effective Person. It's like Stephen Covey and all these different authors who tell us, how do you live your life? What are like the habits that make successful people? We're just like drawn to those types of books for some reason. We also, when we go through like financial issues and we have a lot of money, you can spend your money on anything you want. And yet we turn to podcasts. One of the most popular subjects of podcasts are financial advice. How do you manage your money? How do you reach your life goals? It's telling you how to navigate this complicated thing called money. Parents, you can parent any way you want. You don't have to follow the tradition of your parents or ancestors. And yet we know if you are a mom or even a dad, you are always checking out the mom Instagram accounts, just looking at the life hacks that they do, how they parent their kids, what the stages that you're supposed to parent your kids. Why do we do this? We're free people. You do what you want. Deep down, we know we're kind of lost. We need guidance. We're not flourishing in our finances, in our parenting, in just life in general. Even though you have complete choice over what you do, kind of lost. And that's where Exodus tells us that for us to navigate through the chaos of life, you need guidance. You need something more than Stephen Covey or Instagram moms to help you. What Exodus actually argues is you need the law of God. You need the 10 Commandments. Deuteronomy chapter 4, verse 1 describes the 10 Commandments as this. Israel, listen to the statutes and ordinances I am teaching you to follow so that you may live. This is something that gives you life. It's not just advice, it is life-giving instruction. And I know what we're all thinking. Really? The 10 Commandments? That gives me life? That's what I've been missing? Life will feel more flourishing with that? How so? Why is this important? How does this help me? We're going to tackle those questions today, a little bit next week, and we'll tackle it in 3 ways. Number 1 is, what are the 10 Commandments? What are they? Two, why do we need the 10 Commandments? Like, why do we not just need it in the peripheral of our background, but like you need it in your life right now? And three, how do we follow the 10 Commandments? So what are they? Why do we need it? How do we follow it? First, what are the 10 Commandments? So Israel, they delight in the 10 Commandments. They're like, this is awesome. It's like, I know people in this room, like some of you love soccer. Like, I do not like soccer. Like, I don't get it. And I know it's not soccer's problem, it's my problem. Like, I have a problem because all around the world, people love soccer. And there's probably something I don't get for me to not have this high view of soccer. And I'd argue the 10 Commandments are the same way. We think it's like whatevs. And yet Israel, they see something beautiful about the 10 Commandments. Why? I think we're missing something. And there's a couple things I want to share to highlight what the 10 Commandments are. Number one is this: the 10 Commandments, they are distinct, different than everything else that we see, particularly in the scriptures. A lot of non-Christians, what they'll say is, oh, you believe in the 10 Commandments? What about all those other commands in the Bible? Just keep looking through Exodus. You're going to see way more commands in those 10 Commandments. In fact, if you read the Bible, there are 613 laws given to the Israelites. Why do you Christians pay attention to only the first 10? Why don't you pay attention to the one about don't eat pork, don't eat shellfish? What do you say about that if you want to be biblical? And oftentimes as Christians, we get stuck with that. We don't know what to do. And yet what I'd propose is, no, let me tell you what the 10 Commandments, the reason why we pay attention to it isn't just because of this recent bias that we have. There is something radically different about these 10 that separates it from the rest of the 613. First of all, these 10 commands are the only commands that are written in tablets of stone. All those other commands that are seen in the Old Testament, Moses writes it in a scroll. But these 10 are on tablets of stone, like you see in the movies. We're told in Exodus they're written by the finger of God, not by the finger of Moses. And we're also told that of all the commands, only these two, the tablets of stone, are put in the Ark of the Covenant where the presence of God is there. Versus all the other commands, they are not put in the Ark of the Covenant. They're just there with the people. And so to summarize, why are these put on the stones? Like, what's so special about these 10? And we're going to talk about this way more next week, but just to put on our church's radar, the 10 Commandments reveal the will of God, and the other 613 commands show you how you apply it in life-to-life situations. That's why the commands, these 613, feel kind of weird when you read it. Like, what's going on? It's because they were living back then, long time ago, not in our time, but back then in agrarian culture. The way you apply the 10 commands is going to look really different with them. But the general principle of the 10 commandments, that is the will of God, which is why they're so broad. If you want to put it a different way, think of the 10 commandments as the U.S. Constitution, these broad governing guidelines for our country to live by. And then the 613 laws in the Old Testament, those are like case study laws, those trial laws that you just go to just make sure that we are living a just society. That's kind of how the 10 Commandments function versus the 613. Talk about it way more next week as well. Secondly, the 10 Commandments, they are also relational, which is something that we do not often equate the 10 Commandments to be. Oftentimes when we view the 10 Commandments, we think it's like this random list of rules dropped down for all humanity. So we'll evangelize people like, hey, have you ever murdered? And we just kind of say, this is the 10 Commandments, and we put it like in our courtyard or in the teacher classroom saying 10 Commandments for the United States. But when you do that, you kind of remove the 10 Commandments from the Bible, because the Bible, at least at our church, what we say is the Bible is a story. These don't come out of thin air going, hey, 10 Commandments. Like, this comes in the middle of a story, and it happens starting in verse 2. Look at your Bibles one more time. Look what the 10 Commandments comes out of. Verse 2 in Exodus 20, this is how Yahweh starts it. I am the Lord your God who brought you out of the land of Egypt, and then 10 Commandments. It's not just command, but he tells them, he's telling them the story. He's recapping it. Chapters 1 to 18, Exodus. I brought you out of Egypt. Exodus 19, Mount Sinai. Let's get into a relationship. We call it covenant. What does that look like? 10 Commandments. This is what the relationship, the covenant, is supposed to look like. Let me give you an example of this. When I asked my wife at the time when I first met her, when we were first meeting as acquaintances, and I asked her out on our first date, I didn't go, hey, you want to eat at this restaurant? And she's like, yeah, sure. And I didn't go, hey, but before we go, do you promise to love me? Sickness and in health, for richer or for poor, to death do us part. Only then will I go out with you. It's like, that's weird. First of all, that would really freak her out if I did that, because it's like, I don't even know her that well. We're not in a relationship. It's just not appropriate to demand that of her before we're even in any type of binding relationship. When did we make those vows? On our wedding day. when we agreed to marry each other. And we explained on our wedding day these vows that for richer or for poor, sickness and in health, till death do us part. That is what we are committing to, and that is something that my wife and I are committing to one another in this relationship. The 10 Commandments are the same thing. These are not rules for all of humanity going, all of you who don't know God, make sure you follow the 10 Commandments. That is not how the 10 Commandments are presented. For all of you who want to follow Yahweh, where you say, I am a follower of Yahweh, I believe in the Bible, I want a relationship with Him, the 10 Commandments are for you. It is not something for the Canaanites. It is not something for the Egyptians. It wasn't even for Israel when they were in Egypt. When did they get it? After Egypt, after they were in a relationship with Yahweh, and Yahweh asked them, do you want to do this? And they're like, yes, we'll do it. And then Yahweh says, and here are the terms of the covenant. It is actually a relational document, covenant vows between God and His people. Last thing to know about the 10 Commandments, they are personal. When you're introduced to the 10 Commandments, oftentimes, they are not seen as this personal thing from a God who cares about His people. How is it often presented to us? It's like this, right? This is our first introduction, these random tablets with these laws saying, this is what you should do, this is how you should follow the 10 Commandments, and how can you not think that these are just moral codes to make you a good person? And that's how most of us view the 10 Commandments. These are just moral philosophy codes, like 10 fortune cookie things to let us know, if you want to be a moral person, follow this. And yet, if you rip out the 10 Commandments out of this relational context, you totally misunderstand what the 10 Commandments are. That was the mistake of the Pharisees, where they just saw them as rules, whereas in reality, it comes from someone who actually is giving a person, a personal God, to his people. In fact, nowhere in the Bible are the 10 Commandments called the 10 Commandments. That is something that Christians made up, that have called it the 10 Commandments. You can't find it in the Bible. You know what the 10 Commandments are referred to? The 10 words. These are 10 words that Yahweh has for Israel. Or they are called the Torah, which is translated oftentimes as law. And again, law sounds legal, but you know where the word Torah shows up so often in the Old Testament? Book of Proverbs, where the father tells his son, son, listen to my Torah, listen to my instructions. The 10 Commandments are primarily instructions from a father to a son. There's an author, his name was Ron Mell. He authored many books, but he said the most meaningful book he ever wrote only sold one copy. In fact, he couldn't even sell it. He had to give it away. It was a book that he wrote to his son when his son went off to college. He said this book, of all the books, he poured the most thought into because he wrote it by hand. He thought through it. He even went to the bookstore and had his professional publishers make it into like a real, official, legit book. And he gave it to his son before he went off to college. And the reason why he gave it to his son was he knew this is the first time his son would be away from the household. And he wanted just something, some type of guidance for his son to have as he navigates the real world. And he was sharing how he was surprised how emotional the process was. Like when he was writing what he wanted his son to know about like romance and failure and love, he was just like weeping because there's like this deep desire of like, I want my son to flourish. I want him to do well. He probably won't care what I'm writing, but I just want so badly to communicate what he should learn because I don't want him to learn through trauma. I don't want him to learn through mistakes. I want him to learn through guidance, how he should navigate through life. And so he would say when he gave it to his son, he was delighted when he saw and visited his son in college that the book was actually in his bookshelf. He didn't throw it away. And even more delighted when one day he caught his son reading through his book. Like, can you imagine, dads, if you saw your son reading through a book you wrote for him? That just delighted the father because that's exactly what the whole purpose of the book is. The 10 Commandments are the same thing. They are not these arbitrary rules just given by a politician saying, listen, everybody. It's like a father to their child as Israel goes into the wilderness. And these are like instructions for them to flourish in this context. And I think perhaps this is why for a lot of us, we're just kind of lost in life as you're navigating through whatever season of life that you're in. Because again, as I mentioned earlier, the law of God, when's the last time you thought of it? Like, when's the last time you're like, oh, the 10 Commandments, am I following it? Like, it's just not on our radar, especially even in the church. And I think for a lot of us here, that's why you agree with the basic principles of Christianity, like, oh, I have faith, it's through faith, through Jesus, and there's heaven and so forth. But to follow the way of God is not really there for us. God is someone who's far away, he's distant. And a part of that might be because of the way we were raised in the church. Like we think, oh yeah, the Old Testament, isn't that for the law? But New Testament, we're by grace, by faith, and so forth. And yet, when you read New Testament, that is not how they talk about the law of God. They don't go, oh yeah, that was for people a long time ago. Jesus, when he's talking about the law of God, he doesn't go, oh, now that I'm here, don't worry about the 10 Commandments. Jesus tells his disciples, don't think that I have come to abolish the law of the prophets. I did not come to abolish it, but to fulfill it. It is so important that I'm going to make sure it's fulfilled. The Apostle Paul, he writes in Romans chapter 7, he says, the law is holy, and the commandment is holy, and righteous, and it is good. Author Kevin DeYoung, he summarizes like this. He says for Christians, quote, we still need the 10 words handed down at Sinai. Had they been changed in some respects by the coming of Christ? For sure. Transformed, but the commandments show us the way to live, the way to love our neighbor, and the way to love God with all of our heart and soul. When I check with our members, a lot of you, you're spiritually dry. That's like a constant theme I hear. Like, I love God, I believe in God, but I just feel dry this season. I just feel really dry. Marriage is dry. My walk is dry. Life is dry. And if that's you, just know you are in line with everybody in the Bible. Israel, they were always dry. They were always struggling spiritually. Just read the Old Testament. Just dryness. You know what woke them up? Do you know when Israel experienced revival? When they rediscovered the law. When Josiah, Hezekiah, Nehemiah, they're like, oh my gosh, the 10 Commandments. It's like us. Oh my, I haven't seen this since VBS. And they rediscovered the law. Something happened in the nation of Israel where revival happened. And that same revival is possible for us today, because the reason why a lot of us are jaded is because you're all about the grace of Christ, but grace doesn't mean anything if without the law of God. If the law of God with grace is there, where you see the law, this is something God calls me to do. And in light of the law, the grace of Christ, that's what awakens our soul. If it's just law, you feel terrible. If it's just grace, like a lot of us here, you don't really care. Like, whatevs. But the law of God, with the grace of God, something happens that awakens God's people. And perhaps, whether we realize it or not, we actually need the law of God in our lives far more right now than we actually anticipated. The law of God is something we're called to delight in, and it makes us delight in the Lord. Now, let me explain the next point, which is why. Why do we need the 10 Commandments? The 10 Commandments, again, we're all familiar with this. If you don't mind, I just want to briefly review what each command says so that we can kind of better understand what's going on here. 10 Commandments. Number 1, it says in verse 4, no other gods. Hey, as Israel, this is God's instruction. Don't have any other gods. Back then, everybody worshiped many gods. But Yahweh is saying to Israel, you're a group that's going to be different. You're only going to worship Yahweh. That's the first command that's given to them. Second command, do not make idols. If you wanted to be a farmer in the land of Canaan, and they go, how do I plant a harvest? What the Canaanite would tell you is, oh, so here's the god Baal, here's a statue, make sure you worship him, because that's how they function. There's different idols for different lands to do different things. And that's how Israel, the land they're going to enter into. Yahweh says, you're going to be different, no idols. You're not going to make a graven image that reflects who I am in a different way. Third command, don't misuse the name of God. I used to think as a kid, oh, this means don't take the Lord's name in vain. That means don't cuss, don't say the F word. Just so that's not what it says. I'm not saying you could say the F word, but that's a different conversation. That's not the third command. I used to also think it meant, don't say like the Lord says, and I swear to God, like don't say that. I used to think that's what third command said as well. I've actually kind of been thinking more, and there are different books where they actually argue, some scholars, that the third command, it's not you saying the Lord's name in vain, but who represents the Lord's name? It's the Israelites. Like, they're known as Yahweh's people. Don't misrepresent him the way you live your life. If you're like having broken marriages and broken relationships, you're making Yahweh's name look actually not good. Versus if you're thriving and loving and caring, you're making Yahweh look great. And the third command, I would argue, is saying, make sure the witness and reputation of Yahweh, that you make it look great and it's not taken in vain. Fourth command, remember the Sabbath day. Nobody had a day off back then. The idea of a weekend, we are beneficiaries in the modern West for this heritage of the idea of Sabbath. Back then, everybody worked 7 days a week. Israel, they were called to one day, do not work. Command number 5, honor your father and your mother. This is the triggering command. All of us have been repeated by our parents. Listen to this command. But just know, this is not a command just for young children. Back in Israelites' days, they used to live together in the same household 3 to 4 generations, a child, a parent, a grandparent, great-grandparent. And so this command is for all of them, saying no matter how old your parent gets, they are still in the image of God. You must honor them always. Let it be a culture of honor in this society. Command number 6, do not murder. This implies that even though you might hate somebody, they are the image of God. We do not have the right to take the life of anybody unjustly. Command number 7, do not commit adultery. Sexual intimacy is reserved for the covenant of marriage because Yahweh, when he's in covenant with Israel, is exclusively with one another. Command number 8, do not steal. God gives to everybody, and so we are to be content with what God gives to them and what God gives to us. Command number 9, do not give false testimony. Again, I used to think this meant don't lie. True, that's not what the command is saying. What it's really saying is false testimony, meaning in the court of law, do not give a false witness about somebody because that's going to bring injustice to the people. And command number 10, do not covet your neighbor, anything that they have. And this is the most unique command because this is a command you can't tell if someone broke. It's only something you can't see. It's just you know, it's in your heart. And this is really fascinating that the commandments end this way. And those are the 10 commandments. This is the instruction Yahweh gives to Israel. Again, nothing new. We're all vaguely familiar with this. Why these 10? Why does Yahweh go, these are the 10 things that you need as you go in the wilderness? A couple of thoughts. One is all these commands, they touch upon the fabric of society. What makes the society go? These 10 things are critical for any culture to flourish. We think these commands are meant for me as an individual because we're American. We think, this is for me. It's not meant for individuals primarily. It's meant for a culture. He's building a nation, Israel. It's for a community. And so these are the touchstones of what makes a community work. And he's saying this is what's going to flourish the community. These commands, these are the kind of topics. It talks about God, talks about worship, reputation, time, family, relationships, marriage, sex, property, justice, heart. All those things, you need God to guide a culture like that. And that's what Yahweh wants for Israel. So this is something that he touches upon to make sure Israel as a nation flourishes. Also notice these commands, they are the opposite of how Israel lived in Egypt. Israel in Egypt, they had Pharaoh as their god. They had many gods in Egypt. They were surrounded by idols. They could never rest. They were working 24/7 as slaves. They experienced genocide and infanticide. Their family structure was always in a very fragile place. They were exploited for their labor. They constantly were able to respect their own property. They were murdered. All these commands are meant to counteract what they were used to in Egypt. I don't know if you guys know, but back there we have a new soundboard. It's glory in it. No one notices it, but that soundboard is what makes all this work, like the soundboard. And if you ever work with a soundboard, there's all these different mics and instruments that has to be connected to it. And there's something on a soundboard called the default setting, meaning as soon as you put it in, there's a default setting. And just know when I hear all the music from a default setting, I don't notice a difference. I'm like, sounds great. It's because I don't know music at all. All the musicians are like, that sounds terrible. And then we have to adjust the settings. Israel, their default setting was Egypt. To just have this sense of, there's many gods, and make sure I don't have any property. Their default setting was anxiety, was scarcity, was worry. That was their default. And no one thought it was a problem because that's all they knew. What the 10 Commandments are, this adjustment to the defaults going, that's not beautiful music. That is not the way to live. Look what it's producing in you. Anxiety, worry, scarcity. This is how you live freely. That's what the 10 Commandments are doing for the Israelites. And this is especially what's important to us. Notice what the 10 Commandments, what they focus on, and most especially what they don't focus on. If you were going on a backpack trip for a year, and your dad was an expert backpacker, you would think his advice would be, hey man, when you go on this backpack trip, go here for water. Or hey, if you see a lion, run. Or hey, use a spear, that's what's going to kill animals. You would think he'd be giving all this advice for you to survive and protect yourself. Yahweh, he's going to send Israel in a 40-year journey in the wilderness. And notice what the commands focus on. As you go, if you want to live, love God. Let that be the focus as you go in this journey. And not only that, love your neighbor. Let that be your focus. In fact, that's how Jesus summarizes the commands. If you want to summarize the commandments, what all these are saying is love the Lord your God, all your heart, soul, mind, strength. Love your neighbor as yourself. Because this is what you need to navigate life. This is what is most important for you as you journey in your life. And the reason we need the 10 commands in our life, and we need to be reminded of this, because you naturally have 10 commands that you follow, and it is the opposite of this. All of us here, if you think about it, you have life principles that you live by, and you only see it when you're in trouble, but they rise where there's these principles from a bad experience where you went through something, you're like, never again. And then once you have that experience, you navigate through life trying to walk around a certain way to make sure that you're going to be okay. People, they call this childhood vows. They're vows that we made as a child to protect ourselves. And these are these inner values that we have. So for example, let me just draw us a couple of values that we might have. I want to be successful, or I'm going to be successful. I want to be admired. I'm going to be respected. I want to work hard. These deep values that we hold on to that nothing's going to change that. Or we have other values from hey, I'll never be like my mom, ever. I'll never get hurt again. I'll never open my heart to people who ask me to share my thoughts, my secrets. I'll never get cheated on. I'll never trust again. I'll never be exploited. We have all these vows, and the sad thing is they come from pain. It's usually painful, traumatic moments where we create these vows, these principles, going, I'm going to walk through life like this. And when you take a step back and you see what these vows are about, they're all about love for yourself, and they're all about protecting yourself from your neighbor. The opposite, the inverse of the 10 commands. Love myself, protect myself, and as a result, how happy are we? Do you not realize this is why we're so self-conscious? Because we're kind of worried all the time. This is why we're closed off to people. This is why we have a hard time trusting folks. This is why we're so insecure, because there's all these painful moments that we just experience by chance. It created this value system, and we are walking around with that being our inner value system that's there, and it is so focused on the self. Just know you're like an Israelite. You're like a slave. That's bondage because you're freaked out. And what Exodus tells us is that is not flourishing. That is not the way you're called to live. The 10 commands are meant to confront us. It inverses that where life is not about you. And it's not about you protecting yourself from people. Life is about giving yourself to others, and life is about someone bigger than you, someone who's going to make you whole if you give yourself to him. And that's why when you see Jesus Christ come into the world, he fully loved God, he fully loved his neighbor, and he was the most peace-filled, loving, joyful, calm, secure human being that ever walked on the face of the earth. He did not protect himself from people. He was not somebody who just focused on himself. He just focused on others because Jesus shows us that's true life. That's what it means to be free. And when we compare our life to Jesus, how big and clear are our shackles? But we are so worried about people's opinions, their view of us, because we are trying to protect ourselves all the time, because we care so much about ourselves. The 10 Commands awakens us to just how far we are from true humanity and what we need in order to become the human that Jesus Christ calls us to be. Do you know your default setting? All of us have you have a default setting, a soundboard that was moved by pain. Do you know what that is for you? You know it's a default setting in your life when there's something really broken in your life, whether it be your relationships with people, your relationship with your parents, your sexual expression or experiences, your view of money. Something is broken and you're seeing the damage come out of that because the voice of God is not there. The tablet of God is not informing you. It's your own tablet that you wrote with your own fingers, and you think that you could get by with that, and it's catching up to you. And that's why the 10 Commands, they're meant to be a gift. Find true life. Find true life
from the life that the world is telling you to live. Now it leads to the last point, which is, how do we do this? How do we follow the 10 Commandments? Israel, they're told, hey, you're slaves. Here are the 10 Commandments. You want to do it? And they're like, we'll do it. And that's how Exodus happens. Like, yeah, let's do it, man. And the question is, did they do it? If you've stopped the Bible reading plan here, you have no idea. But if you're with us and you're trekking with us, oh, you know, like it gets pretty bad. The book of Exodus, it's funny, the way it's structured, you have all these laws, boring. And then right after the laws, you're going to see there's this random story of a golden calf. And it shows like, man, like we just told you, don't make a golden calf. And they make a golden calf. Like, what's your problem? And so moral laws are given just to give to Israel. Book of Leviticus, boring laws that we're like, why are all these laws here? But the fun part is like there's this random story in the book of Leviticus about Israel rebelling. And we're like, oh, that's cool. But wait, what's going on? There's law, rebellion, law. Numbers is wild. Get ready for Numbers. All these laws given in random places in the book. But in between those laws are given, there's all these stories of rebellion. What's going on here? There's a point the author's trying to make. He's not just putting these random laws to bore you. It's trying to show no matter how many laws Yahweh gives to Israel, they keep screwing up. They can't follow it. And that's why Deuteronomy ends where Moses, he gives them the law one more time. He goes, you're not going to do this. He tells them his final speech before he dies, like, here are the 10 Commandments. I know you're going to screw up. You're going to mess up. And Moses tells them it's because the problem isn't your willpower or you don't have time. It's your hearts. There's a hardened heart that Israel has. And unless that changes, you're never going to change. And that's how Deuteronomy ends. Like there's a heart problem for Israel. And that's so problematic because they're supposed to go to the promised land. And God tells them, I'll keep you there if you keep the law. They don't keep the law because of their hearts. They get exiled, and so what's their hope? They're screwed. And yet, what's interesting even for us today, when we see the law, we're going to realize that, man, try to follow it, you just can't do it. We have the same problem. And it's not because we're too busy. It's not because, I'm a young mom, I'm a young dad, I just can't even pay attention to this. Like, dude, no, the Bible makes it really clear. There's something messed up about our hearts. Not only do you can't do it, you don't want to read about it. Like, you don't want to read about the law. It's like, it's so boring. What chance do we have to follow it? What chance, therefore, do you have to be in the presence of God? Why should you go to heaven? Why should God want you? You're like the unfaithful spouse. Like he tells you this is what to do to be in a relationship, and you're like, whatever. Like, what gives you the right to be in heaven? And this is where, dude, the Bible is so cool. That's why I'm like so adamant, like, let's read the Bible. There's these details that if we don't pay attention to, like we just miss out on like these awesome things that are there. The 10 Commandments. How many tablets are they on? 2, right? There's 2 tablets. There's this and this, right? And you see the picture of Moses. Now, why are there 2 tablets? A lot of us think it's because, the first half of the commands are on one tablet, the second half of the commands the other tablet. As if God, he couldn't find a big enough rock to put the whole commands, right? Like he had I ran out of space, so like two tablets. Maybe. That's a possibility. Or, what a lot of scholars argue is this is how you did covenant. Whenever you made a covenant with somebody, you had 2 copies of the same agreements. Think of a contract. When someone writes a contract for you, he keeps it, he tears out the yellow part, and he gives that copy to you. Why? So you can know the terms of the agreement, so he can know the terms of the agreement, so if anything goes off, it's not because we're ignorant, it's because we have proof that we agree this is the agreement, and we're going to agree to keep the agreement. The 10 Commandments are functioning the same way. 2 copies of the exact same covenant. One should go to the people, and should you imagine the Israelites to just have it on display for all the people to see, and one should go to God, which is representing the Ark of the Covenant in his presence. What's fascinating is in the book of Exodus, we find that both tablets, they actually go to the Ark of the Covenant. Exodus chapter 25, put the tablets of the testament I give you into the Ark. Tablets, plural. Both of them are in there. Why? Because even though we are called to follow the 10 Commandments, Yahweh says, I will make sure we keep it. I will make sure that this covenant will last. Yahweh knows you're going to screw up. And that's why Yahweh says it's not going to be on you to make this relationship work. It's going to be on me. That's why we see Yahweh at a different mountain. He comes down in the person of Jesus Christ. And in the person of Jesus Christ, he became an Israelite because the Israelites, they kept messing up. And Jesus Christ, he fulfilled the law. He loved God, loved his neighbors, fully represented the personhood of God to all the nations. He did what Israel could not do. And we think, oh, Jesus did that because he's God. Not that simple. The New Testament constantly points to Jesus able to fulfill the law because he is filled with the Spirit of God. The Spirit of God came in Jesus, and that's why the New Testament makes a huge point that Jesus, once he resurrects, he doesn't depart going, good luck. He gives you the same Spirit of God. The Spirit of God that enabled Jesus to obey is the same Spirit of God that enables his people to obey. That's why, remember the day the Spirit of God came down in the book of Acts? What day was that? Pentecost. Very fascinating. The day the Israelites celebrated the law and that the call to follow the law of God is the same day the Spirit of God came going, now go live it out. Go live it out, church. Because you're not doing it on your own anymore. The Spirit of God now dwells in you. And that's how we live out the ways of God. And so our question is, so what do we do today? What is our practice? Should we go home and look at the Ten Commandments, go, how do I follow this thing? Like, what do I do? And, maybe. I'd actually argue that's not what New Testament Christians are supposed to primarily focus on. Let me give a quick analogy. If you told me today, hey, you should run the marathon, Tom. It's coming up. It's so life-giving. You should do it. Even if I believed you, I don't believe you, but even if I believed you, yeah, it's life-giving, I couldn't do it. Not because I don't want to, but I don't have the capacity to do it. The only way I could run that marathon is if I slowly train myself, build up these things called muscle fiber. Muscle is just building it up, and at one point, it's going to enable me, if I keep doing it, to have the power to run that marathon. In a similar way, if I told you, love the Lord your God with all your heart, mind, soul, and strength tomorrow, you can't do it. You could try, I'm going to love him all I can, but you just can't do it because you don't have the capacity to do it. But one thing that we're told we have is you have the Spirit of God. And you need the Spirit of God to have more of a presence and influence over your soul, where he could be more and more empowered and in you. And so that when that day comes, when as the Spirit has more and more influence over you, you can slowly begin to actually have the capacity to love the Lord your God, to love your neighbor. That's why at our church, when we say, hey, every day, 10 minutes, be still. Come before the Lord. Be silent. Remember the Spirit in you. Read the scripture as he speaks to you. Pray before the Lord. What that is an invitation to slowly allow the Spirit to have influence over your flesh so that as you continue to fellowship with the Spirit, the 10 Commandments are not these faraway principles, but they are something that you have power to actually live out. We need the Spirit of God. And through Pentecost, we have the Spirit of God. We can live life. And so as we take a moment to pray about this, can I pray for us on our behalf of our church, that the Lord would move in our community in light of the law of God? Let's all pray.